So I like a good cheesesteak as much as the next guy, or maybe even the next few guys. But I do have one major problem with them. Let me show you. So when I went to Philly to eat cheesesteaks, I tried all three of the typical cheese options: Whiz, Provolone, and American. And when I tried the Provolone, I wasn't the biggest fan of it. At the time, I thought it was because of the sort of strong, sharp flavor of it, and it might have something to do with it. But it wasn't until a couple weeks ago when I went to one of my favorite bagel spots here in Cleveland that I realized my real problem with it. They serve a bagel cheesesteak with provolone, and while I was eating it, there was really just one thing that kept coming to mind. Yeah, this needs a sauce. I mean, I can't think of a single great sandwich that doesn't. Roast beef has au jus, deli subs have mayo, pulled pork has barbecue sauce, even hot dogs and hamburgers need ketchup or mustard to feel complete. But that doesn't mean I'm just gonna use Kraft Cheese Whiz. I mean, this stuff does have the right saucy consistency, but in terms of real cheese flavor, it's definitely lacking. I mean, cheese isn't even one of the ingredients in here, so I think we can definitely do better. But if both Whiz and Provolone are out, all that leaves us with is the American cheese, which I did really like when I went to Philly. It melts super well, so it provides some nice creaminess, but it does also have some problems. The first is that it's also lacking in the flavor department because just like the Whiz, it's not really a real cheese. But also, as soon as it starts to cool down, it gets kind of thick and goopy and honestly pretty unappetizing. So because of that, I still don't think that it can serve as an ideal sauce for this sandwich, at least not on its own. Instead, I have a different idea. Now, I do want to keep this sandwich relatively traditional, so I'm not going to venture outside of these three options. Because after all, each one does have something that I like about it. Whiz has the sauciness, American has the meltiness and creaminess, and Provolone has the flavor. So basically, my idea is to make a cheese sauce that takes each of these best traits and combines them into one. So even though the sharp provolone that I tried in Philly was a bit too funky for my taste, that's not the only option. Instead, we could go with a milder provolone, which I think should be just about right, and it should also melt better into the sauce. The question is though, how do we actually turn it into a sauce? Well, that's kind of what I still need to find out, but there are a few methods that I saw mentioned during my research. The first is what I'm going to call the lazy method, because it basically just involves heating up some cream or milk and then melting the cheese into it. The potential problem with this method is that basically all you're doing is melting the cheese, so I'm worried that it won't stay saucy as it cools. But that's what our next method tries to address. I'm calling it the French method because it's basically just a traditional French Mornay sauce. For this one, we'll start by making a roux with equal parts butter and flour, then we slowly whisk in some milk, and then finally melt the cheese into it. The idea here is that the flour thickens the sauce so that you can use more liquid and it becomes more of an actual sauce as opposed to just melted cheese. However, that flour and butter will add a bit of flavor and possibly a grainy texture, so I'm worried that it may stray too far away from a traditional cheesesteak cheese, which is where our next method comes in. I'm calling it the Kenji method because it was written by Kenji Lopez all on SeriousEats.com, but it addresses the flavor issue with the French method by using cornstarch to emulsify the sauce rather than a roux. So we toss the grated cheese in cornstarch, then add it to a pot along with some evaporated milk, and then just heat it up until it's melted. Kenji claims that it should stay melted for longer than any other method, but as always, we won't know until we try. Alright, so I've got the lazy method, the French method, and the Kenji method. And I've kept all these warm as close to the same temperature as possible so that I could compare them all side by side. Now for all three of these methods, I used 3 parts provolone for every 1 part American cheese. And then I used varying amounts of liquid depending on the recipe, but I'll leave all the full recipes in the description below. Since American cheese is basically engineered to stay creamy and smooth as it melts, I think it is important to include at least in a small amount, but since I do want the sauce to taste mostly like provolone, that's why I started with the 3-to-1 ratio. The only one I had trouble with though was the lazy method. When I tried it that way at first, I may have heated it a little bit too much, but my sauce broke pretty easily. Obviously, if I had cooked it a little more gently, I think I could have prevented that, but I don't want a sauce that's gonna be so finicky, so I actually decided to make one with a 1-to-1 ratio, meaning half provolone, half American cheese. And so that's the one that I'm testing here. Now, I wanna try these before they cool too much, so let's see what we're working with. And as of now, it's been about 5 minutes since I poured these into the containers. So let's start with the lazy method, now the French method, and now the Kenji method. Alright, so one thing I know for sure, the French method is definitely out. Just as I kind of suspected, the flour definitely adds a distinct flavor, and it actually gives it a slightly grainy texture as well. So it's not really what I'm looking for in a sauce for a cheesesteak. Between these other two, it's a pretty close call. So the Kenji method definitely stays smoother and creamier for longer, but the evaporated milk also gives it kind of a weird flavor. It actually makes it a little bit sweet. So just our basic lazy method is actually not bad. I mean, it stays reasonably creamy. We're about 10 minutes in and it's still not completely solidified. I mean, if your sandwich is cooling to room temperature or refrigerator temperature anyways, you're gonna wanna heat it up before you eat it. So I think this would probably be okay, but I have one more thing that I wanna try. All right, moment of truth. I think this is it. Let's make some cheesesteaks and we'll talk about it. All right, let's give these babies a try. All of these are actually really solid sandwiches. I made one with each of the three classic options, or at least my take on them, which I'll explain in a minute. But you might be wondering what this fourth one is. And I actually tried making a cheese sauce using beef stock as a liquid instead of cream. And it's definitely not bad. I thought it might be nice to kind of enhance the beefiness of the sandwich, sort of like dipping a roast beef sandwich in au jus. But I'm not sure if it really works here. I think it kind of overtakes the flavor of the cheese. So it was a novel attempt, but we're gonna disregard this one for now. So that leaves us with our three classic options. And really, I think there's a good option regardless of what type of cheese that you typically order on your cheesesteak. If you like whiz, I would recommend just using Kraft Cheese Whiz because, I mean, that's what the places in Philly are gonna be using anyways. So if you want the authentic taste, that's the way to do it. However, this one was actually my least favorite out of the three. My next most favorite was the American cheese. I mean, eating this sandwich, it brings me right back to the one that I had at Angelo's in Philly. I think I've already gotten pretty close here. And as long as you're eating it while it's still hot, the American cheese stays nicely melted, and so it's got that nice saucy consistency that we're looking for. And one thing that I actually haven't mentioned yet is the brand of American cheese you use can actually make a big difference. The specific brand that a lot of places in Philly use, Angelo's being one of them, is called Cooper Sharp. So I was able to find it at one of my local stores and I compared it side by side with Land O'Lakes. I think it has a slightly better flavor, but more importantly, it melts a lot more nicely. It's kind of like using grande cheese on a New York style pizza if you watch that series. It is the best cheese out there, but you can still use other brands and achieve that same authentic taste. Now, while I do personally like the taste of American cheese, I know not everybody does, and so that's where our last option comes in. As you might have guessed, it's basically just an improved version of our cheese sauce from earlier. What I did was I replaced the evaporated milk with cream, and that completely eliminated that weird sweetness that I was getting. And then for my taste, I found a 50-50 blend of American and provolone to give me the best flavor. But that's something that you can completely customize. So if you like a more provolone taste, I even tried one with 100% provolone, and it works fine as long as you're including the cornstarch in there. You could also do it with 100% American, although I don't know that that's really necessary because the American does melt pretty well on its own. For me though, this is what I'm going to use going forward. It's exactly what I set out to achieve. It's got that provolone taste, but basically with the texture of American cheese or possibly even saucier. Honestly, I didn't even think it was going to work out this well, but I definitely recommend you give it a try. Now, if you haven't seen the last episode where I talked about the steak I'm using and the process I use to make these cheesesteaks, you can check that out right here. Otherwise, you can check out the next episode once it's uploaded right here. Either way, thanks a lot for watching, and I'll talk to you in the next one.